Hey, thanks for joining me today. Today I want to talk about the book of Romans. Romans is a great book to help us understand what the Bible actually means for us today. If we look at Romans 1:16, it says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes." So the gospel indeed is powerful, but for us to completely understand what it saves us from, Paul will help us understand why we need the gospel so much. So, in the second half of this chapter, verses 18 through 32, Paul shows us what the gospel has come to save us from. So, let's start with verse 18, where Paul says, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness." So God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen from what has been made, so people are without excuse. The gospel is good news, but before we can understand how good it is, we need to understand what it saves us from. And Paul talks about the wrath of God being poured out for godlessness and wickedness. In Greek, there are two words for wrath. The first one, thumos, which means explosive or irrational rage. That kind where you just get angry like a lot of people have when they're driving. Now, the second word is orge, which it refers to a wrath that builds over time and it's directed intentionally. So we see that God's wrath is not out of control. It's the justice of a just God who judges in measured ways because evil needs to be judged. Now, we might want a God who is all grace and all love, but we also need a God who is just, because without justice, who would deal with the atrocities of this life, like the Holocaust or human trafficking? So we need both grace and justice. God's wrath is directed towards humanity because we suppress the truth. We try to push it down like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. It eventually comes back up no matter how hard you're pushing on it. Paul says there are two things that everyone ought to know about God, learned not from the Bible, but from nature: his eternal power and his divine nature. These are clearly seen so that no one has an excuse to deny God's existence. Nature is God's first missionary to man, as Max Lucado put it. But when we suppress the truth, we exchange God for idols, the first stage of rebellion. We trade glory of the immortal God for images made to look more like mortal humans or animals. Idolatry reduces our dignity because we're made to know God and to reflect his glory. But instead, we worship things like money, power, and prestige. And every time Israel fell into idolatry, their society degenerated. So the second stage is that God gives us over to ourselves or to our own desires. When we exchange the truth of God for a lie, we start to worship the things of this world, and God lets us go in that direction. We see this clearly when Paul describes sexual sin, particularly in verses 26 and 27, where he addresses unnatural relations. Paul says that because of humanity's rejection of God, he gave them over to their shameful lusts. Both men and women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones, meaning they engaged in practices contrary to God's design. This includes all forms of sexual sin, heterosexual or homosexual, that fall outside of God's intention for the marriage between one man and one woman. When we step outside of God's design for sex within the marriage, we not only sin against God, but we also harm ourselves and others. So this is a clear example of how we turn away from God, and he allows us to experience the consequences of our choices. The third stage of rebellion against God leads to a depraved mind. Paul says that when people did not think it was worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They're all gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but they also approve of those who practice them. This passage highlights the breakdown of not only individuals, but society as a whole. When we reject God's truth, everything from our relationships to our social structures suffer. Marriage is a prime example. As society moves further from God's design for marriage, we see a rise in divorce, broken homes, and all the pain that follows. This disintegration is a result of humanity's rebellion against God, and it affects every part of our lives. The big idea is that we need the gospel because of this. So the wrath of God is coming against us, and in our sin, we deserve it. But the beauty of the gospel is that Jesus came to save us from the wrath of God. He lived a perfect life. He died on the cross in our place, absorbing the wrath of God for us. When we place our faith in him, we are reconciled with God, and that wrath is no longer for us. So, as we close today, let's reflect on our own hearts. Are there areas where we have exchanged the truth of God for a lie? Where we are suppressing the truth? Let's remember the amazing grace of God given to us in Jesus Christ and rejoice in that.